I think we can get going.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So listen, I want to welcome all of you who have joined us for this wonderful presentation that we're about to hear. This part of the MIE seminar series that we offer to kind of introduce you to some of the professors in our department. For those who don't know me, my name is Marcus Bussman. I'm the chair of the Department of Mechanical and Industrial Engineering at the U of T. And it's a great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Professor Scott Sanner of the industrial engineering side of MIE. So just very briefly about Scott. So Scott is an American originally, studied at Carnegie Mellon, did degrees in computer science and electrical and computer engineering. He went off to Stanford to do a master's degree and eventually came to the U of T to earn his PhD in computer science, earned that in 2008, so a few years ago, and then headed off to Australia, where he worked for a number of years as a researcher and an adjunct professor at the National ICT in Australia, a research organization that was funded by the Australian government. And it was only, I think he was there for 7, 8, 9 years, and then came back to North America and joined the U of T and MIE in 2016, so 5 or 6 years ago. Scott's expertise, and I'll let him explain it, but is in machine learning and AI. And that has made him a very popular professor in this department the past few years. So he has quickly built up a large research group, a large number of graduate students that are working with him, has gotten lots of interest from organizations and companies who want to partner with him on research, has done a wonderful job teaching courses on these topics. And, you know, as the chair of MIE, I'm privileged to kind of get to see course evaluations, and it's very clear that the students really appreciate having Professor Sanner teach him. And he's won a number of awards as well, kind of these past few years, even while at the U of T, you know, in many cases based on the work of his students. But I think most noteworthy is just in 2020, Google actually awarded him a faculty research award for what I think is the research that he will talk about today. So I will now hand it over. Just a couple of housekeeping matters. So there is a Q&A button at the bottom of this screen. If you have questions that you'd like to ask of Scott, I don't think he's not going to monitor the Q&A necessarily during the talk, but we certainly will take some questions at the end. And then I just want to let everybody know that if anybody wants to meet up with Scott after 1 p.m., we will be heading over for a few minutes at least to a different app, to something called GatherTown, which is a place where kind of a more informal place where people can gather, and there'll be a link to GatherTown kind of put into the Q&A towards the end of this session. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Professor Scott Sanner.
Okay, thank you, Marcus. Yeah, indeed, the work today is going to cover what's put me on Google's map. And in fact, let me share screens here. So I'm not exactly sure of the background of everyone in the audience. So this is a talk I've given to Google and to LG and some other corporations. I've given lots of talks academically. I tried to sort of distill down sort of some key high-level ideas. Just as I was going over my slides now, I thought, you know what, actually, I'm probably going to skip a bit of content. So I apologize. I'm going to skip some slides here in the talk. But in any event, I really do appreciate questions and feedback. I don't really see the questions as they come in, but I don't know if Marcus sees them, or if someone has a quick question, feel free to speak up. It helps me track, what people are getting from the talk and by what questions they have. So I certainly don't mind an interruption here and there.
Okay, so I'll take that. I don't think the audience can talk to us, but if I see something that I think is worthy of interruption, I will do that. Okay.
Yeah, please do. Okay, so the title here is "You Don't Know Me: The Need for Personalized Recommendation and Conversational Assistance." The whole claim throughout the talk is that we love our personal assistants, Siri, Alexa, Google Assistant, right? But they really don't know us. And that's, my goal with my research group in the past 2 years has been to fix that. Okay, and this is I've done this work with a huge group. In fact, I even need to expand this list now to include probably 5 or 6 more people, including Google now and LG. It's the work I'm going to present is the result of a huge effort of collaboration with many corporations and many lovely students. Okay, so my claim is that for the future of conversational AI systems, they should understand and adapt to us, right? And I'm a machine learner. I'm by training, I'm in artificial intelligence, machine learning, so for a system to understand us and adapt to us, that's personalization. But more technically, right? If you're looking at the machine learning field that focuses on personalization, that's called actually recommendation. Just FYI, we don't really notice it, but whenever we interact with e-commerce websites, we're interacting with recommender systems. When Google search is even becoming a bit personalized in various ways. The ad serving is certainly personalized. You go to Amazon, I wouldn't say Amazon's somewhat personalized, but Netflix, for example, really knows what you've watched. So I guess my point is we don't always realize when we're going online that there are recommendation systems powering our interactions, but they are. Actually, one example I'll come back to throughout the talk is YouTube. So for me, YouTube was always just a site with videos. And then the pandemic hit. And then, constantly I'm trying to work all day and my kids are home and it's daddy, daddy, daddy. Yes, son, where's mommy? So at some point I become a bad parent, and I'm like, yeah, here, son, here's the iPad, why don't you just watch some videos for a while? And it's quiet for me, which is good. But then an hour later I go down and I look at my son's iPad, and he's just kind of glazed over eyes, looking at his iPad. It has, just auto recommended, a whole hour's worth of content, and he's just letting it go. It's just easier to not interact, right? And I realized at some point that, YouTube is raising my kids. They have more quality interaction with YouTube. Well, I'm not sure it's quality, than I'm having with them on some very busy days. And this was quite scary. But the thing is, YouTube is powered by a recommender, right? That's what's giving my son the next recommendations. And I guess the point again is that recommendations are really ubiquitous, but it hasn't made it into our AI assistants yet, and that's where we want to get it in next. But by the end, I'll come back to the ethical questions of is this always the right thing? Okay, so personalization is recommendation, right? And I'm focusing specifically on our conversational AI assistants. And the question is, well, how personalized are they, right? And, I think you realize this probably from your interactions, but I'll make the case that they're really not personalized at all. They don't know you. And if they did, you would have a lot better experience too. So, they don't engage in natural conversation with you about recommendation, right? And I want to point out, this is more than just a lack of effort. This is an incredibly challenging problem. I've had to become sort of a jack of all trades in linguistics, NLP, human psychology, a little bit of ethics now, just to start to tackle a lot of these questions. And so it's a lot of fun, but it is an incredibly challenging problem. So hopefully I'll be able to impart some of those challenges and maybe a little bit of the solution here in this talk. But one key thing I want to point out is that, especially for Google and others, there's a way that they've built up their backend architectures to support search and question answering and conversational assistance. And the reason you don't see personalization in these assistants is because what you need for recommendation is inherently disjoint sort of from the technology that you need for standard conversational AI. And again, that's why my group is really trying to bridge that gap. I'm surprised there aren't more people like me doing this, but I'm happy to be the person doing it. Okay. So if we want personalized AI assistance, what's the solution? Well, as I tell my students, let's figure out what problem we're solving first. Okay, so actually, this isn't. So this is last year's talk. Sorry, I need to update it to 2022. But I just want to give you some vignettes of things that happen with our assistants that are incredibly annoying. And you say like, why can't Google fix this? And this actually comes from my colleague in Oregon. And he wakes up every morning and he'll say, "Hey Alexa, play OPB." Right? OPB is Oregon Public Broadcasting. But Alexa's trained on a lot of data and it doesn't really hear OPB too much. And in Alexa, like dutifully every day says, "Okay, now I'm playing OPP for you." Okay, well, I'll let you Google that one if if you don't know what it is. Anyways, not the song that he wants blasting throughout his house with his 3 kids listening. And so every day he's like, "No, Alexa, I meant play Oregon Public Broadcasting," right? And once he corrects it and once he spells it out, right, Oregon Public Broadcasting, then Alexa figures it out and plays it. Great. Okay, that's yesterday. Today, "Hey Alexa, please play OPB." It's actually very appropriate. I think today is Groundhog Day, right? So this is exactly the experience we have with, if you know the movie, the experience we have with our recommenders, right? Today it's just making the same mistakes, right? There's no. This is trivial personalization. This is just rotely memorizing a mistake you made yesterday to not make it today. And our systems don't even do this, right? They're still making the same mistakes. We're having these, amnesiac conversations with our systems. Okay, so let's look at searching for a restaurant. You can ask Google Assistant, for restaurant recommendations, but again, it's a very amnesia-prone system. So you say, "Hey Alexa, I'd like a nice vegan restaurant." And so, if you're downtown, say, how about Saigon Lotus, really lovely vegan restaurant downtown. But actually, I live in Scarborough. That's where I am right now. And I say, "Well, hey Alexa, can you give me a restaurant in Scarborough instead?" I say, "Great, Scott, here's some Korean barbecue." Well, okay, fine, that might be in Scarborough, but the unfortunate thing is, I just said first turn here that I was vegan, right? So I don't know. I don't know vegan Korean barbecue. If you know it, let me know. Anyway, so the systems just lose context very quickly. So let me envision what I would love the assistant to do, right? What's a more natural conversation? Okay, so I say, I'd like a nice vegan restaurant. System says, "Okay, how about Avelo," right? Now I'll come back and explain what's interesting about some of these responses in a moment. And I say, "Okay, well, actually, can you give me a restaurant in West Rouge instead?" And the system will say, "Sorry, I can't find a local vegan restaurant, right? But Thai Express has vegetarian options, right? I don't, within a kilometer radius of me, there aren't a whole lot of options, right? And system sort of is aware of that and is trying to negotiate some trade-offs with me. Okay. So maybe it's a date, maybe for some reason I would like, a nice experience, not just, and I'm not just doing this to get food. And I say, "Does it have nice ambiance?" Because, I saw Thai Express. I'm like, well, it sounds like fast food. And, I'd like to sit down and have a nice meal. And so the system now says, "Well, I'm not sure, but if you don't mind driving 15 more minutes, right, I could maybe go to the vegan restaurant Fresh, right? Another lovely vegan restaurant that has a great atmosphere." So what's interesting about this conversation? Well, I chose Avelo because it would be more personalized to my preferences, right? Not just here's McDonald's, here's Avelo. Here, it's remembered, right, that I said I was vegan, right? So a bit of context. Okay, now it's noticed that I said I was vegan. It only found vegetarian options, right? And so now it's qualifying the explanation. So what's really interesting, and I'm going to tell you a lot about studies of human conversations that we've done here to try to understand what makes a good human conversation. And what we found is that explanation, is not just used to convince people, you should go here. It's also used to focus on things the system may be uncertain about. to make sure the user is okay with that, right? So I asked for vegan. It says it actually chooses, of all the things it can explain about Thai Express, it chooses vegetarian because it wants to make sure that if I don't like, just vegetarian, right, I really mean vegan, right, then I can critique and say, no, I really absolutely need a vegan place. So explanation is actually often used to help the user validate that the option is appropriate for them. You actually explain the things to the user you're most uncertain about their preferences for. Okay, so now the next thing is, note that I asked a question here. I asked, does Thai Express have nice ambiance, right? And the system realized, okay, Scott, this is a question, but it's really actually a statement of preference. And the system actually will then say, well, you know what? I'm not really sure about the I'm very uncertain about the ambiance, right, of Thai Express. I look at the reviews and they don't really mention this. So the system automatically makes a second recommendation, right? But realizing that it's a bit further, mentions the part it's unsure about, right? Here's a vegan restaurant, it's great, people love it, it's got great ambiance, but do you want to drive 15 more minutes? Again, focusing to explain on the things that would be uncertain about in my preferences, which has been a very novel realization about explanation that the literature sort of, I think, has missed a lot. Okay, so now this is a sort of a vignette of a dream interaction. My group is trying to build these sorts of real personalized interactions. I'm going to talk about some of the challenges of doing this. Okay. So our AI assistants are currently a huge, impressive engineering effort. I mean, I can't reveal details and numbers, but I've talked to my colleague, big companies, and it's amazing the manpower, the person power that goes behind building these systems. It's a lot of good technology and then a lot of humans engineering templates. In fact, these systems are actually currently very large finite state machines, and this is actually quite sad for me because this is quite primitive, right? It explains immediately why you run to the end of the memory and it forgets what you were talking about, right? I really want to emphasize finite. These things just don't have memory.
Scott, can I just interrupt? Somebody has asked, Xiaoqi Wang has asked, given that you're speaking of AI as starting to collect personal data, where would that data be stored once extracted?
Be stored. Well, this system has to. I mean, Google knows your entire history. I mean, I've worked with a lot of companies, and I can't say too much, but you'd be surprised at what they record about you. Sorry, just lost my power supply. So. Yeah, I mean, there's servers on the back end that store all your history, and they leverage this history for the recommendation. You wouldn't have personalization without knowing some history. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I can say more than they store it and they use it. And in fact, how you use it is what I'm going to get to in this talk.
Okay.
Okay. So. Okay. So. I mean, we currently have conversational AI, right? We can ask questions. I can ask how is Barack Obama, and Google tells me. I can even ask for a while. I could ask who is Scott Sander, and it would read off part of my webpage. And I'm really upset now that it doesn't do that. You can tell the technology is constantly changing. So we have conversational AI, but we need personalization. It's really the key to future assistance, right? I mean, this whole conversation here is something I could not have without personalization. Right? It has to know me. It has to know what I like, what my preferences are. It has to know what it knows about me and what it does not know about me, right? It doesn't know about my driving preferences and my ambiance preferences and so on, right? It's learning from me through the interactions and hopefully using that in future experience. Okay, so great. We see this opportunity. We don't have it. That's my whole job in life. Say what are we missing in the world that we could do better? Right, and then try to solve those problems. And so, great, let's build the future. And this is where we were in 2018. And actually, I do want to just digress for another second. So I had the misfortune on a very icy day in 2018 to break my ankle, something on the ice. And this had me, for 6 weeks, quite immobile, and watching a bit more Netflix in my life than I've ever watched. And I was just, what really led me to start this line of research was for 6 weeks, me trying to get something I wanted to watch on Netflix and me just saying like, why couldn't I just tell the system what I want? Why am I faced with this infinite wall of scrolling choices? Why can't I just say, I like a really cheesy comedy that's upbeat. Why can't I just say that, right? And so a lot of this work actually I can credit to breaking my ankle. Not the most pleasant experience. Okay. So before we, if you know the Feynman algorithm, right? It goes something like it's 3 steps for all problems. Let's see if I get this right. It's like step 1, formalize the problem. Step 2, like think really hard. Step 3, I think write down the answer. That's the key to research. And well, in those 3 steps, right, it turns out that formalizing the problem turns out to usually be the hardest part, right? So, okay, we sort of want to build this conversational recommender system, but we have to really understand the structure of this problem much more. We can't just start engineering things, right, and see where we end up. We need to know what we're engineering towards. What is the prototype for a good conversation? Well, it's what I would have, a conversation I would have with my friend, hey, John, can you recommend, some places for this? You know downtown better than I do, right? So if we want a good human-like conversation, like let's actually study human conversations. I have to say that I don't particularly enjoy running user studies. They're quite painful. It takes me a little bit outside of my comfort zone. But in this case, how can you not run user studies to understand, what makes a good human conversation? Okay. So so I'm going to take you into some user studies and tell you what we learned. And we're focusing on restaurant recommendation. And we really have a very heavy context. You'll see. We tell the user you're out on a date, it's Valentine's Day, or you're out with your family on the weekend, large family gathering, it's a birthday party. So we give context to users to sort of drive the interactions. So we'll say, you're on family brunch on the weekend, with young child, parent, and spouse, and the reason we do this is because unlike most studies, we find that having a strong context, which really relates to, how we interact and practice with our systems, right? Any given day, we have an intent behind why we're asking for something, right? So knowing this context really leads to much stronger preferences and constraints, right, than a lot of studies that I've seen that are non-contextual. Okay. And our key, all I want to do initially is just understand the workflow. Like, what are all the different interactions we have to support in these human-to-human conversations? So, we have a user, we have the assistant, right? And we have 2 things to look at. We have the user intents, broadly providing preferences, requesting information, critiquing, right? And then we have the system actions, right? What can the system do? It can recommend, it can, so should we clarify, sorry, explain. In fact, this is just the tip of the iceberg. So if you go back, probably a lot of the dialogue work started off late 90s, early 2000s, when people realized, we could start talking to our systems and have dialogues. And so we now have these super rich taxonomies. This is the user intent taxonomy. And, this has been developed for over 20 years. A lot of these sorts of interaction labels you can find in papers from 20 years ago. But now, more recently, in recent work, people would say, well, how do you extend this to recommendation and personalized conversations? That involves a lot more user intent. So I know this is a lot to look at. I just want to say that, the structure of human conversation is quite nuanced. And just at a high level, there are many ways to ask for recommendation. There are many ways to provide preferences. I can provide context. Refining preferences, I'm going to come back to, is a really important part of the conversation. I can provide answers to questions the system asks. Acknowledgement, yeah, right. These things are really critical for the system to track. Is my user with me, right? So, quite simple, almost non-informational aspects of conversation, but actually quite important for a system. How I provide feedback on recommendations, right? How I inquire and ask questions, how I critique, how do I say things that I don't like? I want this, I don't want this. How does this compare to this? And so on. So that's just the user intent taxonomy, right? Then the system, right? What are the recommender actions? Again, large taxonomy being developed over 20 years and extended more recently into the recommendation space. There's requests, it's sort of all, informing progress. If your system ever is going to delay, it should tell you, give me a few seconds to search, right? Otherwise, you're like, are you still there? Acknowledgement on both ends is still important, answering questions, making recommendations, explaining. In fact, we're going to find explanation is at some point the bulk of the conversation. It serves many purposes, as I already pointed out. So we had this very nice taxonomy that we've extended ourselves with some new codes. And so let's see, yeah. So I had a graduate student who came to me and said, yeah, I want to run a user study. And I said, well, that's very rare. I don't have many students who want to do that. Be careful what you wish for. But she did. She ran a beautiful user study. Probably a lot more work than she thought she was getting into, but she did an amazing job. And we got a really well-cited paper out of it. So we ran 12 dialogues, with two pairs of participants. So, one playing the role of the system, one playing the role of the user, one playing the role of the information seeker, and one playing the role of the recommender. Again, we're just trying to get a human-to-human conversation. The recommender had access to Google and Yelp, so they could say, so they could sort of do live searches. We also chose the recommender to know restaurants in Toronto very well, right? So typically they could just go from their own knowledge. And just, statistically, each transcript, each interaction had about 1,150 word tokens and 60 turns on average. In fact, the turns went from 130 down to some shorter conversations, which were more around 25 turns, 25, I go, you go, I go, you go interactions. But 25 sort of the shortest, right? Which is still a lot of interaction. About 19 words per turn. Turns out the recommender, if you look at just the amount of conversation happening, the recommender is doing a bit more talking than the user, right? And actually, we're going to see that comes down to the explanation, right? The recommender is spending a lot of time explaining things. Okay, so anyways, we have more details in the paper. If anyone is interested in this, I will be happy to respond to an email and provide the papers that back this talk. I do want to mention, we've gotten criticized, only 12 dialogues. If you look in total at the amount of content the student had here, they had, about a short master's thesis worth of text. And this student had to annotate every word in every sentence of that short master's thesis worth of text, right? It was, immense amount of work to label these conversations according to all these intents that I just showed on these previous two slides. So huge amount of work, but as a Zoe supervisor, I can say it was well worth it because we really learned a lot. Okay, so the first thing we realized about the conversation was there are really three distinct stages that we could see. And they're kind of obvious in retrospect, but you have to study it first to see it. Then stage one, the user's coming in and they're saying, I'm going out for dinner this weekend. I'd like a place, that can seat at least 10 people, hopefully not too crowded, not too busy, has high chairs for the children. So the first stage is just the system providing a lot of preferences, right? And then what's the recommender doing? The recommender is refining those preferences, and it's saying, well, you asked for parking, do you need free parking or, is paid parking nearby okay, right? So there's a lot of refinement coming from the system as well to try to best understand the user preferences, right? And then once that initial conversation quiesces, right, the system says, okay, I'm ready to make a recommendation, right? And so out goes the first item, here, how would you like Avelo? How would you like Thai Express, right? And then you switch to the second stage where there's a lot of, inquiry and critiquing. Well, does it have nice ambiance? How close is it? Is it parking? just to make sure that this fits, the needs of the user, as people often don't know what they want until you give them something and they know they don't want that, right? And so you kind of have to give the recommendation in order to get the feedback, right, about what was wrong with it, right? So that leads to what we call critiquing. And critiquing drives a lot of the information that will then drive a second, the recommendation of a second item. But once you get to stage 3, where we have 2 or more recommendations, then what you see is a lot of comparison, a lot of trade-offs. Well, okay, this one's closer. How expensive is it? In these conversations, I mean, they can be amazingly complex. But again, so you see this preference stage, the first recommendation stage, and then the 2+ recommendations, where you can then do lots of comparison and trade-offs. Eventually, you hit resolution. And our reviewer said, "What about abandonment?" Right? Well, we had very friendly users in our user study, and so they didn't abandon. But in practice, you have to monitor abandonment. You have to, and you have to, realize when our users becoming frustrated and going to leave, and how do I resolve that? Not something that we had to deal with in this study, but an important problem in practice. Okay, so again, in these 3 stages, let's sort of look at the amount of effort spent in each stage. There's a lot of effort spent in stage 1, which is the preference solicitation, right? Stage 2 is actually quite short, right? Here's the first recommendation. Almost immediately, the user will see something they don't like about it, right? And that leads then to going on to 2+ recommendations, right, in stage 3. And then here, there's just a ton of explanation, trade-off, negotiation, and so on. And who's doing more talking? Well, it turns out initially, unsurprisingly, the user is doing more talking, right? Because they're trying all the preferences. But then once there's a recommendation made, right, then actually the conversation is shifting. The bulk of the recommender is doing the bulk of the explanation. Okay, so in mechanical engineering, they use Sankey diagrams to analyze energy flow. We use them in conversation to understand conversation flow. So it's a lovely tool. And so, what we're looking here, we're looking at this first stage, right? This is the preference solicitation stage. And we're looking at, well, when the recommender has an action, right, which is labeled here on the left, and here we've compressed a lot of the actions to make the diagram more readable. When the recommender has an action, what's the typical user response? And when the user has an action here, what's the recommender's typical response? And okay, so if we look at the user, they're spending most of their time providing preferences. It shouldn't surprise you, right? But they're also spending a lot of their time answering questions from the recommender to try to clarify the preferences. And that's what that's what you see the recommender doing, right? It's making requests. Do you want this? Do you want this? Do you want this? Sorry, I keep on losing my power supply, which would be bad. Okay. And why is there so much of this interaction on preference, answer, question, clarification, right? It's because user preferences are often ambiguous and underly or overly specific. And so we saw lots of cases where the user would say, I'd like a place with chicken fingers, right? I'm going out with my kids, I like a place with chicken fingers. What the user really meant is that they want a place with a kids menu, right? And chicken fingers for them was synonymous with a kids menu. But the system will say, well, okay, do you really want chicken fingers, right? Or did you just mean a kids menu? And so we really see that humans are overly specific, right? And this is bad for recommender because you don't always have all this information. And it really constrains the recommendations, especially when there are multiple preferences. So we just have a paper coming out this year talking about, how do you do targeted relaxation of these preferences. Do you want a kids menu as opposed to chicken fingers? It's a really critical part of the conversation. It's a really critical flaw of human preference specification, that we are more specific than we should be. Okay, now once one recommendation is made, this workflow becomes a lot more complex. But I'll just note a few high-level details without going into a lot here. If you look at the recommender, bulk of the effort here is on explanation, right? We didn't quite expect this going in, but it turns out to be the case. And if you look at the conversations, you can understand why, right? most of the users' critiques, the questions they make, the additional preferences that they have, these all follow explanations from the recommender to say, oh, actually, I don't want that, right? And again, this is why the recommender should be using explanations actually to explore the aspects of the item it's uncertain about with respect to the user preferences, which may not be how we think of explanations. But again, the point here is not to convince. The point here is to kind of validate the appropriateness of the recommendation. And we really saw that, a lot of requests, it does have parking, and so on. All these questions were actually preferences, right? It does have parking, is it quiet, right? And a good human, right, will pick up on this and automatically recommend something else that might meet these preferences more. Okay. So they're still in the third stage, a lot of explanation. And at some point, then the recommender is just sort of making sure to reveal all the details of the user and confirm. Okay, we're good to go. Here's your recommendation. But there's a lot of trade-offs here, right? There's a lot of trade-offs. Users specified a lot of preferences, a lot of constraints, and so the system will say, well, they don't have a private room that you asked for, right? But they have an open space separated from the others. Would that be sufficient for your needs? Okay. So let's see. I'm looking at time here, and I want to leave time for questions at the end. And this is a voluminous talk. I think I'm going to skip some of these details. Okay, so we started to study the conversation, right? If we want to build a personalized conversation, what does it consist of? Well, it's quite complex. Hopefully, as you've started to realize, as we did, there's a lot of intent on the user and the recommender side to support. But there are clear stages to the conversation, right? And knowing what stage you're in is quite important to knowing how you want to structure the interactions. Really, these psychological errors, right, or these cognitive errors and specifying preferences, were quite important to resolve. We saw a lot of mixed initiative. Sometimes the user was taking the initiative, sometimes the recommender was taking the initiative in the conversation. And that's an incredibly hard thing to do, right? When should the system, lead the conversation? When should it sort of sit back and let the user? But we really saw a lot of this mixed initiative interaction. So questions, serve as implicit preferences, right? That was quite interesting. And then the fact that explanation drives a lot of the conversation, right? That's something we didn't expect as much as we saw. Okay, and so the explanations, interestingly, are often personalized, right? Because I know your preferences, and they're also exploratory, right? To actually evoke more interaction. Okay, so how do we build a system? So let me, with many failed efforts is what I can say. The next set of slides were meant to highlight some of the early failures that we made in building systems and studying them. And I'm just looking at the time and realizing that I don't want to overload you. So let me highlight. I'm just going to cover this quickly to cover some highlights. So we ran lots of studies, and we wanted to get rid of the language interaction aspect, because that is what I'll get to in a few minutes. Its own incredibly difficult problem, how you combine language with preference understanding. So to get rid of the language aspect, we built these interactive systems, these interactive recommenders where everything was sort of click-based, so we could just deal with well-known categories and phrases and avoid a lot of the language aspects. And so let me skip forward to, I think, the conclusions here. So when we built these systems, well, we had to provide things to critique. Do you want parking? Do you want, what sort of expense do you want? How close do you want it to be? Ambiance. There are all these things that you can critique about a restaurant. And so when you provide in a user interface, a ton of options, it's too much cognitive load for the user. But when you go to a conversational system that's not UI based, but now it's just language based, problem is people don't know what to critique, and kind of until you tell them something, they don't know what to provide feedback on. And furthermore, I think so this issue of what to critique. Can we help the system? Can we help the user critique? It turned out to be a very large question we tried to answer. And secondly, we were inquiring about user frustration. And what we found is that, users would be heavily constrained in their interactions. And then the system would say, sorry, there's no vegan steakhouse in the middle of downtown with free parking. Sorry, so how to relax those preferences and get something the user still wanted, that was incredibly challenging. But we call these failure cases, right? In that, the preference spaces are constrained and there's no options, and then getting out of that dead end is actually quite challenging. And so, having seen these huge problems in our first round of interfaces, we tried to address them. We tried to introduce what we call system suggested critiquing. So the system's trying to say, well, would you like this or not? Remember, previously we were doing a user study. Now we're actually trying to build systems and see if we can, recreate some elements of the recommender, right, and see how the user works. And suggesting things to critique, right, was one key part of that. And then actually suggesting trade-offs, right, for failure handling, right, is another key part. So we did find that when we did system-specific critiquing and failure handling, the bulk of our users were satisfied with the system. So we have made progress. But what was interesting is that, the more interaction you have with the user to help them provide critiques, help them negotiate failure, right? Actually, the time taken, right, was double if we help them with critiquing, and by doing failure handling, we can reduce that a little bit. But the point is, this interaction with the user, right, does come at a time cost. And with users, at some point, you're not going to interact for 30 minutes with the conversation. So really being parsimonious with the conversation turns out to be really important. So many constraints to think about, so many issues. Okay, so what did we learn from our initial system building? Well, fortunately, the more personalization we included, right, the less effort involved. And the users did prefer systems that sort of help them know what to critique and express preferences on, right? So you just, so if I say, hey, Marcus, tell me what you like in a restaurant. It's just really hard to just elicit all those things you like, it's just easier when the system will help you do that. Okay. And users do prefer systems that help them navigate over constrained preferences, because this is a really bad failure mode of these systems. And what we learned here is that, just like my kids, just like your kids if you have them, users need a lot of support, right? And you need personalization and recommendation everywhere. It does help if done carefully. Okay, so let's go a bit more into building recommendation systems. Now I want to talk a little bit about the language, and then I'll try to wrap up. So I'm not a natural language person by training. I'm not a linguist by training, but you can't work with conversational feedback and language-based feedback and not have to deal with these problems that the NLP field has been dealing with for 40 or more years. And so language in recommendation really comes in heavily in a few places. There's a lot of templated interactions where you don't have to think too much about what to say. Here's your first recommendation, right? That's easy. But explanations are quite organic. Eliciting preferences are quite organic, and critiques are quite organic. Just think of the space of things you can state preferences on or critiques on. Think of the range of explanations that I can give, right? So this is where language has to be sort of tackled head on. Now, explanation is still something that my group is working on, but we've done a huge amount of work on the purpose elicitation and critiquing side. Okay, sorry, I did get my slides out. Yeah, okay. So I wanted to have a colleague at Google, and his claim, which I really like this quote, is that natural language processing and recommendation are on a collision course. If you look historically at these two fields in the research, they are distinct fields. Recommendation, is largely on the machine learning side, and actually also on the human-computer interaction side of research. And NLP and linguistics have always been it's a very interesting field. And this field drove existing conversational assistants, right? Which is exactly why they're currently not personalized. And again, I want to point out the technology to do recommendation just looks, very different in implementation than what you'd use for NLP. But if you're going to personalize these conversational systems, right, you're going to have to make these two systems play together, right? And so Alex said, NLP and recommendation are on a collision course, right, for sure. And again, I'm surprised at how few people work at this intersection, but more people are being interested. Certainly, Google's interested, and we're trying to solve this problem. Different perspectives, different histories, different argument incompatible techniques. It's kind of like OR and AI. We kind of solve the same problems with different ways. But forget your differences. We have to solve this. So how do we bridge this gap? I'm going to provide one. I'm going to provide 2 slides of technical detail. Some of you may get this, some of you may not, but just to let you know kind of where we're going. And this is, the bulk of my group's work, all sort of papers listed at the top, including, coming out here in a few months, is going this direction. So if you know modern natural language processing, if you know deep learning, it's all about embeddings. Why do we call the Vector Institute the Vector Institute? It's not because we're using matrix algebra and matrices and vectors. It's because the vector is the embedding of the world, right? We can encode the world into that vector. We can decode that vector out to other things, right? We can encode a English language sentence into a vector. We can decode that English language vector encoding to the French translation. And all of deep learning works with these embeddings. I have another talk on this topic for anyone that wants to hear it. Actually, I give it to high schoolers, so it's pretty accessible. But just accept that we have to work with embeddings, which are just these vectorial representations of information. That's how language works. And so I say more ambiance and relaxing atmosphere. These things just get mapped to big vectors. Okay. Now, the preference information, right? The preferences, right? The way we handle this in recommendation is also mapping the preferences to vectors. So if our language is sort of has a vectorial representation, and our preferences that we use to recommend have a vectorial representation, clearly the question is, how do the language vectors modulate the preference vectors? Like that is the key question my group's trying to answer. Whole cottage industry papers at the top try and answer this question. So, right, how do we combine the user's latent preferences and critiques via language? Now, my group's worked at a whole lot of methodologies. Recently, we've had a lot of success with the Bayesian methodology. But let me tell you the first thing we did, because it's accessible to those who may have seen deep learning before. So let me see how this works. So deep learning models, I think of as neural circuits. If you know a logical circuit in computer engineering, then just think of modern deep learning as building neural circuits, right? So we'll do things like we'll feed in, here I am, and here are my preferences. Again, everything's a vector here. It's also why we did the Vector Institute. It's all about vectors, right? And then we have items, things like genus. We have beer data sets, so this is where this example comes from, right? And this is an item. And this item has a descriptive vector. Great. So I can describe my preferences as a vector. I can describe the item as a vector. Great. Now the question is, well, how do I combine these two vectors and say, well, given my preferences, would I like them? Now, I see some names from, my courses. If you've been through my recommendation course, you actually have built these sort of systems. In fact, the first thing you can do is take a dot product of UI and VJ, right? And that actually works incredibly well. So if, however I combine those two vectors of user preferences and item description, right, I can get out a rating prediction, right? So here, Scott, we think you like Guinness, right? And then here's why. It's a weedy, heavy, dark, roasty beer. Okay, and actually, I don't know, maybe I've had a heavy dinner and just having a heavy beer after that is just not, not something that I want, right? So, but now I might say, you know what, I don't want, a heavy beer right now, right? So I critique the explanation, and a question now is how to have that critique. How do I do this inverse loop? It's really just mathematics, right? How do I now understand what that critique of the explanation meant to modulate the latent embedding, right? Okay. And then once I modify latent embedding, then that will modulate how other beers rate, and which ones, what's the next highest beer that so now when I critique heavy, Guinness goes down, but other beers will go up, right? This is where we started in 2019. This after I gave this talk, it was a very interesting talk. Apple came up to me, folks from Google came up to talk to me. So it sort of, one of the few times in my life where I've really had a really, a reaction like that with all the industry interaction. And it's actually also a talk where I was told I was undermining democracy. I'm just recommending beer. I've never been told I've been undermining democracy, and I initially have to say it threw me, it threw me off. But the person's point was, well, Scott, if you're giving the user always what they want, our recommenders are always giving users what they want, the news just that they think is true, right? Are you building a unethical system, right? Is it reinforcing echo chambers? Is it exactly leading to the society, very polarized society that we see ourselves in? So from beer recommendation to undermining democracy, whoa, and initially this blew me away, but I started to realize I have to think about these aspects. So let me go through some very technical details. I'm just going to skip over research summary. I just want to go to this last point. We're working with language models and embeddings. These things are called foundation models. The way we do modern machine learning, we don't train everything from scratch. Those who do vision NLP, Google and OpenAI and some corporations will spend millions of dollars training what we call foundation models, right? And then we build on these foundation models to do our specialized tasks. That's how modern machine learning works. It wasn't this way 5, 10 years ago. It's how things work now. There's an entire center at Stanford on the ethics of foundation models. And the reason is because we train these models on terabytes of the web's data, and we inherit all of the biases and everything that is intrinsic in human interactions, for better or worse. We get these in our models. And so very recently I've started to look at, well, maybe I am undermining democracy. Maybe I should look into this side of recommendation systems. And we ran this interesting experiment. And, if I could ever write a paper which would say, expose or truth revealed, something that would be the headline of the Inquirer, it would be this sort of research, right? We found some incredible bias coming out in these deep learned trained systems built on foundation models. So we intentionally engineered preferences just to say, I'm going to dinner with, and then all you'd say is my friend Scott, right? This is the only thing you said. And then we would see what the system, and we're building these language-based recommenders. We would see what the system would say for the recommendations. I'm going to dinner with my friend Scott, and we get a notably large amount of pub recommendations. I want to mention also, just for context, we ran this in the cold start setting. Cold start means we had no user history. We only have the explicit words I'm showing here. I'm going to dinner with my friend Scott. That's the only thing the system saw. Technically, it's not enough information for recommendation, but the system can still recommend, and we just want to see what it would say. So without knowing me at all, it gives me pubs. Okay. If I say my friend Sally, interestingly, it gives me a lot of dessert-oriented recommendations. Really scarily, and this is quite sad, if I say my friend Jamal, we saw a precipitous drop in the price range of the recommendations, right? If I say my brother and his boyfriend, right? Suddenly the system was giving lots of gay bar recommendations. Now, in one sense, you may say, well, the system picked up on the cue, right, and actually gave you relevant content. It's not so easy. The problem is there were no preferences in my request at all, right? Only thing I changed here is mention of names or mention of relationships, right? And does it make sense if I change Scott to Jamal? That drastically shifts the recommendations, right? Or Scott to Sally, right? Maybe for the bulk of the data, these biases, just may happen to exist in our data. But is it the right thing to do? Should we be reacting to non-preferential statements? And and the answer, and I've talked to a lot of ethical people in information, the answer is like, well, it may have been thinking on cues here, but at the end of the day, you want it to only respond to user history and explicit preferences. Going beyond that is really putting you in a potentially bad territory, right? But the point is, and why I call this, the expose, is because, these biases just live in our models. And we go deploy this tomorrow, we're deploying with these biases, and they can be harmful. Back to my kids watching YouTube, so I can get an hour of peace and quiet, right? These recommenders, right, that we interact with are doing lots of things. And they're reinforcing biases and stereotypes. And they can, at the scale of hundreds of millions of users, be incredibly harmful. And so, can my work undermine democracy? Well, technically it's possible, right? And it's important for me to be aware of that, and for everyone else. Now, there is a silver lining here. There's a lot of work on debiasing recommendations, right? And we've actually found some very simple ways that we can help get rid of this bias. In fact, the answer may be so obvious that you see it already. Get rid of any information that's non-preferential. You have to identify it first. Once you get rid of it, obviously you're preventing the system from reacting to this. Okay, so
Scott, I'm just going to jump in and say it's we're almost coming up on 1 o'clock, and I have gathered a few questions. Interrupting people on Zoom is really difficult, and I kind of have held back. But if you'll finish up shortly,
this is the last slide.
We can stay online for a few minutes and get to some of these.
Yeah. So let me just say the future of conversation. Now I have so many more slides to give, but yeah, this is my final slide here. The future of conversational AI is personalization. It is recommendation. We already have conversational systems, but they're not personalized and they don't know us, right? It requires just an immense amount of effort to understand preferences, ambient language, and for me, endless challenges: machine learning, AI, psychology, ethics, sequential decision making. This brings everything that I've studied in 22 years of research, right? It takes everything I know to try to answer these questions, but these systems will drive our future, right? And my group's working on, what I hope will be conversational AI 2.0. Okay, with that, I'm happy to go to questions, and thanks for bearing with my long talk.
I'm looking forward to coming back in person. It's much easier to interrupt someone when you're in the same room. So just to everybody who's still with us, and I know we have about 40 of you, I'll just take the next 10 minutes or so. And so if you have other questions, you're welcome to put them into the Q&A. I think Scott and I certainly have time for this. I think Ushnish asked a couple of questions early on that in some sense, I think you've addressed here just at the end. He first asked whether one could imagine having these systems actually understand the accent that someone brings to a conversation, and from that, offer recommendations that might be particular to someone's ethnicity. And then also later on asked, I presume the answer is yes, but you may as well speak to it. Could an assistant, a recommender, glean, for example, that you had a car based on other interactions unrelated to a restaurant choice, and then use that information to point you to restaurants that might be a little further away because it knew that you were able to drive there?
Yeah, okay. So yeah, these are great questions. So on the issue of accent, you can pick up, you can do an accent classifier for sure on English or any language, right? For that matter. I guess my question is, do you always want to act on that information, right? Because if just saying, my friend Scott, Sally, Jamal, right, really changes recommendations in ways that are non-preferential, again, sometimes, you may get it right, but when you get it wrong, is it harmful? So yeah, I guess you can. The question is it always a good thing? And for the corporations, they really have to, to struggle with these implications. Related is prosody, which is this notion in speech of the intonation with which I say something. So if I say, really versus really, I'm first time, the first way I'm saying really is I'm questioning, right? And the second way I'm saying it is confirming. Right, so sort of prosody is incredibly important. You can't just look at the text. It helps to know some of the intonation. Now, this is beyond what I'm working on my group, but there are other people that I can point out who are working on this. Finally, what is the dream system, that unnamed industries will have? It's these systems know you. They know your Gmail. They know. I mean, you can ask whether this is a good idea or not, but they have all your information, right? And they have your history for sure. So will they know you had a car in the past that you drove somewhere? They should know that, right? And can they use that in the future? They should be able to. So whether you just go with previous conversational history where you've inferred that, or you go to a broader context, right, of everything I write in my email, it can all be leveraged. And again, the question for corporations is, should we, can we, et cetera. But that is the vision if we had, absolutely no constraints.
Right. So Doug Gerhard has asked a couple of questions, and actually 3 questions. I'm just gonna give you 2 of them. The first he had asked was, could we as humans start to learn how to interact more effectively or efficiently with recommender systems based on using them? And then just at the end, he asked, isn't it, when we ask, we have these concerns about recommender systems acting as echo chambers, but to what extent is that any different than asking a friend for a recommendation? And our friends effectively reinforce our biases as well, don't they?
Right. Okay. So learning to interact with systems. It's funny. We have really adapted to Google search. When I teach information retrieval in my 4th year course, decision support systems, IR being a major method of decision support, we always say, like, if I'm querying, if I'm querying for Scott Sanner, what's the more important term in that, right? Is it Scott or Sanner, right? It's obviously Sanner because it's more discriminative of the results. And so when we query with Google, right, we're very careful to sort of give it the information that zeroes in on what we want. And we've learned to do that over time from a lot of failed searches. And I do think there will be this symbiosis between humans and systems, right? We're never going to approach the human conversation that I had in the beginning, that I, or not in the next 5 to 10 years. Our systems are not human yet, and they won't be human in the next 5 to 10 years. So I do think there will be this symbiosis for what is the right paradigm for interaction, right? That users can learn to work well with systems, and it'll work exactly as the way Google has evolved. And we've evolved with Google, and Google's evolved with us. It's a beautiful co-evolution of human and machine. And then on the question, sorry, the second question was.
Well, he simply pointed out, I think, or suggested that, isn't asking a friend or human friend, so to speak, for a recommendation. To what extent, there's a certain echo chamber even happening there, is there not?
Yeah, so I think, what arguably conversations you have with your friends, you are more than welcome to have, right? We would never let our government regulate this. When you have a system affecting hundreds of millions of users, the question is business as usual, the right thing to do? And this is an ethical question, and I'm not qualified to answer this question. I can assure you of that. All I can say is we should be aware that our recommenders are very much inclined to give us what we want, and tell us what we want. Tell us, unfortunately with news recommenders, tell us the version of the facts that we want, right? And I think it's on the news side that systems are really getting a lot of scrutiny. Should you be serving up, some of these amazingly biased, opinion sources that masquerade as news? So yeah, at the individual level for sure. I mean, you can't personalize without being biased, right? That's the whole point. Is you're not a blank slate, random person. You are you. System has to know you. But when you're at the scale of hundreds of millions of users, you're doing things like news recommendation. Well, maybe giving you exactly what you want isn't the best thing. And so I think it's just a question at the population scale of the globe, what's the right thing to do? It's a question that the industries have to ask. It's very, very different from what works for you and I with our friends, I think.
Thank you. I think there are a few other questions in the Q&A. And do you have access to it?
Yeah. So I'm just looking.
I'm wondering if you may, and I'm tempted to suggest it's already 10 after 1. I had mentioned at the beginning of this that we might head over to GatherTown, but I think there's still 35 people kind of online. I wonder whether you just want to go through a few of those and we kind of set GatherTown aside and let you address a few more things, because I think this might be as good a venue as any, right?
Yeah, I think just given the timing and just given the switch cost of GatherTown, it will be more interactive, but I think I've been perhaps prefer to stay here. And okay, so let's see, I'm just looking through.
Yeah, some of the open questions, right?
Yeah. Okay, so you just size on 24 participants. Wouldn't be useful in any applied ML research, right? Well, for sure. I mean, our goal, we weren't building systems here. We weren't doing machine learning to build systems there, right? We were doing user studies just to understand what is the structure of a good human interaction. As researchers, we carve off a very small part of that, of that interaction to try to solve each piece one by one, right? And this is why I won't quote the number that Google quoted me on the number of engineers working on these systems, but I mean, every person's carving off a piece and trying to answer it, and every piece will require data, for sure. But yeah, this user study was just trying to understand, like, well, what do we even have to solve, right? What do we even have to apply machine learning to solve these problems? Okay, I don't want to go into Yelp and movie lens. I mean, like once you get into my papers, I mean, you get into the weeds of the details. So I mean, if you want to ask me questions about the papers, feel free to ping me via email, and I'll try to be responsive. But I think that would be a bit too specialized for this context. Okay, so Doug's talking about Venn diagram like feedback on over constrained problems, and so I think what Doug's thinking about is how can visualizations help us navigate complex preference spaces? So great question, and I think there's another question about multimodal devices. So what if you're not only talking to your system, but you also have your cell phone in front of you, and you can see the screen, right? And the assistant already gives us some additional information on the screen. So yeah, this is what can you do with that? What can you do with good visualizations? Absolutely amazing question. And I think if we could go beyond just the conversational interaction and go to multimodal interfaces, right, then the sky's the limit as far as what we can bring to bear to help the users address these problems. But yeah, that's a great suggestion. And just with my researcher cap on, I'm thinking, okay, we have to design it. We've got to run a user study. We have to get it right because you often get it wrong. So it's a great question. It would really take a good grad student a while, I think, to actually make progress on it. So, but I love the idea, and I love the multimodal suggestion. Okay, David, you point out the restaurants are somewhat local. Actually, yeah, let me, I'll come back to a question of Yelp versus movie lens. What I've learned in recommendation is that not all problems in recommendation, no two problems in recommendation are the same problem. I can tell you, I did book recommendation with Kobo for a while, And I can tell you there that preferences on books is just completely different from preferences on music or movies. And so Yelp versus say movies, right, is a huge difference. And because movies, everyone's seen Shrek, Titanic, et cetera, right? I can leverage a global population of preferences to recommend to you. When it comes to Yelp, people only rate things locally that they've actually been to. And so when you actually look at the user interaction matrix, users in rows, interaction in columns, what you see is a very block diagonal structure because people are only interacting locally, right, with what's local to them. And this actually makes generalizing across localities incredibly challenging. But through the magic of embeddings and vectors and everything that makes deep learning work and translation work, we can also leverage that to sort of still understand, well, what are your latent preferences? What do you really like, right? That generalizes across localities. And so it's a great question, but we do have methodologies that can answer that. And methodologies only within the last 10 years, really. Okay, so vacations, well, okay, the locality question gets to, like how can I recommend international travel vacations? All I'm going to say is what I've learned is that every domain has its own mode of interaction, its own preference structures and preference set. And I'd like to think that restaurant recommendation can generalize to vacation recommendation, but I would say that's going to introduce a lot of new challenges from my own experience. But yeah, it's a very good question. Do you think there are incentives for companies to give optimal recommendations occasionally? Okay, well, I'm not as much of a human factors person as I probably should be to answer some of these questions. I'm going to defer to my colleagues here, so incentives for companies to give optimal recommendations. I think this is like this is just a great question, right? Like what should companies do? Companies have to balance their business side, their immediate profit, with their long-term profit, which comes more from user engagement, with bias and ethics, right? So if you're very Democrat or very Republican, so let's say you're very Republican, right? In the U.S. sense, and we deem that for the goodness of society, we should also show you a lot of sort of more Democratic party biased content, right? Well, unfortunately, for a lot of users, you just lose them, right? It's like, I don't want that information, they would say. And so when we place a lot of requirements on Facebook and Google to do the right thing, and the cost for them is when they do the right thing, often they can lose users. And even when I give the optimal recommendation in the short term, that can lose engagement over the long term. It's actually helpful. And Netflix has said this, it's helpful for them to be a bit more exploratory in their recommendations, just to explore areas you may not have known about and you may be interested in that will keep you engaged longer term. So in fact, Netflix had a Netflix prize, to do really good recommendation. And they 2 years later, they said, you know what? We paid $1 million for this prize. We got a lot of good research. We can't actually use this in practice, because if we do this, people burn out, in about 10 movies, and then they just cancel the service. This is something that I don't really have the data or the perspective to really answer well, but there are many objectives to consider: short-term, long-term, ethical, and I think all the companies have to grapple with this. I have to say, for better or worse, I am just focusing myself on, can I give the user right now what they want? But as I showed with bias analysis, right, we do need to be aware that that can be problematic. So I didn't really answer your question entirely, but that's probably about all I can say from this point. Vincent's asking about multimodality. And sometimes you have, again, a cell phone, and you can look at it when you're driving your car. So one of my partners is called Inigo. And when you're in your car, their principle is you cannot look at the screen, right? This system has to be purely purely conversational. And then we have to be incredibly parsimonious with the language we're using there to get what the user wants with the least interaction. When you go to a multimodal system, the information bandwidth increases drastically. So there's a new search engine out there called u.com. If you haven't seen it, you might check it out. I think it's u.com, you.com. And they're exploring a lot with when you have the visual real estate of a huge screen, like why are we working with Google with our top 10 search results in 2022? I have a massive screen on my desk, right? Why can't I make use of the screen real estate for better interaction? Well, finally, people are, u.com, very smart guy behind that, is thinking about it. But it's back to the other question, when you have these visual interfaces, Venn diagrams or so on, right? They can really make this interaction way more efficient. It hurts my brain to think about all this, building it, studying it, but I absolutely agree. This is when you are in a context, not in a car, but at home, etc. You definitely want to think about this multimodality, and without a doubt, it can help. Okay, final question. Great, yeah, Will. This is, the question. How much personalization is too much? A lot of our failures and interactions with our systems are because they don't know us. So we can certainly build better systems, that know, even things as simple as knowing we have a car, right? If I have a history of liking pubs, right, it's completely legitimate to recommend pubs to me. You just shouldn't do that if you don't know me at all, right? That could be problematic. So, as with all technology, right, there are benefits and there are drawbacks, and in this area, I mean, we've seen these. Facebook's recommender has come under fire again and again and again. There are congressional hearings about Facebook's recommender, right? And Facebook said, okay, government, you regulate us. We'll make sure we live up to your regulations. As we know, companies are always good at finding loopholes in regulations. Who should do the governing? Government, right? Or industry? How much is too much? I would say that today, the perspective is that we let the individual user choose how much is too much, right? Now under GDPR, this German law on privacy, right? You have to opt into cookies, right? When you go to European websites, right? You get this annoying bar at the bottom that's saying, how much information can we collect on you? So I think the perspective now is we're going to let you opt in. Now the problem is, how many of us just opt in brainlessly, right? We just want to get what we want. How many websites can we ask this cookie question for? I'm actually pretty good at saying no to all cookies, but it takes some effort. And I still don't know what they do collect, that could be problematic. So currently we're taking the approach of giving the user the power of what's collected. I would still conjecture that companies maybe are skirting some of these rules to collect more than they should. It's a great question, but currently we're letting the user decide, hopefully, right, what they will allow to be collected about themselves and then to be used in recommendation.
Listen, on behalf of everyone who is still with us, I know some people had to head off. I think I just want to say thank you. I think this was a fascinating presentation because I didn't realize, I had a sense of what you were going to talk about, but I didn't realize the extent to which I think it intersects with all of our experiences, right? I mean, we're all using these devices, and my wife laughs when I talk to Siri because it never understands what I want, and so I've given up on it. But it's you've really done a lovely job of showing us kind of the complexity of all this, and the fact that I think we're just at the beginning of developing these systems that are really useful, aren't they? Right.
Yeah, for sure. And when I got into this, I was just really annoyed at Netflix, and when I got into this, I really didn't know what I was getting into, right? Until I go to a conference tonight and I'm told I'm undermining democracy, and everything else. And it has been a journey, but it is, I I've done a lot of research in my career that I'm very proud of, but like this is the research that, you know, I can tell will have impact. And it's just it's been an incredible journey, and you know, I'm happy to have shared that with you all. I'm happy that it was interesting. I love the feedback that I got. You know, join my research group. Yeah, I think this is a high impact area, and I, you know, I really hope in a few years I can give this talk again and give a lot more answers than I gave today.
We'd love to have you back. All right. So on behalf of everyone who's still here and those who had to leave, thank you. That was terrific. And with that, I'm going to shut this down, and we wish everybody a lovely afternoon, or what's left of it. All right.
Happy Groundhog Day.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all.